Hi everyone, welcome to my video commentaries channel on YouTube. In this video, I'm going to look at Luke 1 through 4. However, before we get started, I would like to remind everyone that when they see a parenthesized number in the video, that number represents an endnote indicating where the information shared at that point came from. All the endnotes can be found in the description below this video. With that said, let's get started. The first thing I'd like to talk about in this video is Luke's purpose for writing the Gospel of Luke. I feel the best way to do this is to let Luke speak for himself and tell us why he wrote the Gospel of Luke. Let's get into the actual text of the Gospel of Luke and read Luke 1 through 4. Luke 1 through 4. Since many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting to me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in an orderly sequence, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. Now that we have read Luke 1 through 4, let's look in more detail at the first two verses. Right off the bat, Luke acknowledges that other people before him had undertaken efforts to compile a narrative about the events in what is today known as Palestine surrounding the message and work of Jesus Christ. It is most likely what Luke primarily had in mind was the Gospel of Mark when he said this. I say this because around half of the text of the Gospel of Mark can be found in the Gospel of Luke. Additionally, Luke shares another 200 verses or so of material with the Gospel of Matthew. This indicates that beyond the Gospel of Mark, Luke and Matthew also had a second source or second work in common between them. Scholars have taken to calling this second work in common between Luke and Matthew Q, which is short for the German word Quell, which means source. Everything else in the Gospel of Luke seems to be Luke's own work. It was Luke's work in the sense that he went out and talked to the original eyewitnesses of the events he recorded and wrote down what they told him in a fashion that seemed good to him. This conclusion comes from Luke's own statement about how he gained some of his information based on verse 2. It should also be noted that Luke was present for some of the events recorded in Acts and so was an eyewitness of those events himself. We can identify those sections of Acts where Luke was present from those sections of Acts where he wasn't present, because when Luke was present, he used we in the first person instead of they in the third person. Wherever Luke uses the term we, talking about events in Acts, we have called the we sections of Acts. Incidentally, for Luke to have talked to the eyewitnesses of some of the events he recorded argues very strongly for an early date for the writing of Luke and Acts, since the eyewitnesses would have still had to be around or alive for Luke to talk to them. To give you an idea of what the time frame is we're talking about, Jesus was most likely crucified sometime between 30 and 33 AD. For Luke to have talked to people that were eyewitnesses to the events in Jesus' life, Luke could not have written much later than the 60s AD. This is especially true since one of the eyewitnesses Luke had to have talked to was Mary, the mother of Jesus. I say this because some of the things recorded in the Gospel of Luke could have only come from Mary herself. We will discuss those sections when we come to them as we go through the Gospel of Luke in our Bible study. In verse 3, Luke tells us why he decided to write his own work rather than rely on what others had written. According to the first part of verse 3, Luke seems to be indicating that he felt previous works were somehow lacking for his purposes. The words Luke used indicate that he felt the previous works were not carefully enough investigated. This would be especially important if Luke was intending for his work to support Paul in his trial before the emperor of Rome. Luke also seems to have thought how they were organized was not good enough for his purposes either. This again would have been important to Luke if he intended for his work to be used in a trial. This is an idea we will get more into when we talk about the recipient of Luke's work, which would be a man named Theophilus. Another reason Luke might have been uncomfortable or had a discomfort with the previous works relating to Jesus was because Luke was a Gentile. All the other works that Luke would have had available to him would be written by Jews and from a Jewish worldview or Jewish perspective. Christianity comes from a Jewish worldview, not a Greco-Roman one, and so was not always clearly understood by the Romans. The fact that the Romans were polytheists rather than monotheists like the Jews were would have actually made this problem worse. While Luke clearly understood Judaism as seen by his own writings, he still was a Gentile and came from the Greco-Roman background or the Greco-Roman worldview his recipient came from. This gave Luke the ability to explain things to his Roman audience that would have otherwise not been understood by them or even missed. This is seen throughout the book of Luke and Acts, where Luke makes a point of explaining some of the common practices and customs among the Jews in his writings. One example of this from the Gospel of Luke is Luke 22, verses 1 and 7. Luke also often referred to the Jews in the third person, they instead of we, or them instead of us. This shows that Luke thought of himself as a Gentile and not a Jew, because that's what Luke would have been. This brings us to the person both Luke and Acts were addressed to, Theophilus. Theophilus was a common name in the Roman world among both Jews and Gentiles. The meaning of the name is lover or friend of God. There have been some suggestions that Theophilus was a pseudonym to protect the identity of the recipient of Luke's works. However, given how common the name was, it is best to go along with the idea that Theophilus was the proper name of a real person. Of more interest is the honorific most excellent in front of Theophilus' name. This honorific indicated that Theophilus was somebody of some importance or in some standing in Rome. Several suggestions have been made over the years about this. One suggestion has been that Theophilus was the patron that hired Luke to write Luke and Acts, possibly for publishing. Others have suggested that Theophilus was a Roman official such as a governor, procurator, or a magistrate. One suggestion along the lines that Theophilus was a Roman official comes from a person named B.H. Streeter. Streeter suggested that Theophilus was the magistrate who was to oversee Paul's case when it came to trial before the emperor. To understand why Paul's case was going to be tried before the emperor, we need to know a bit about Roman law. According to Roman law, any Roman citizen, of which Paul was one, had the right to have their legal disputes with other people or groups of people tried before the emperor if they felt their case would not get a fair hearing before lesser Roman officials. Paul called on this right when he was going to be tried in Caesarea because he felt quite reasonably that he would not be able to get a fair trial by Roman officials in the area because they would want to try and keep various Jewish leaders happy. If B.H. Streeter's suggestion about who Theophilus was is correct, then Luke and Acts would be the equivalent of court documents that were to be used to support Paul in his defense before the highest Roman court, the emperor. That would be the equivalent of court documents in modern day that are going to be used to support a person before the Supreme Court of the country. This explanation can actually be used to explain a couple of interesting features about the writing of Luke. For example, every time Jesus or Paul were put on trial, Luke made the point of showing that both Jesus and Paul were always officially ruled as not being guilty of crimes against Rome, despite whatever else may have happened with the situation. This would also possibly make sense of the general feel that part of the reason Luke was writing the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles was to prove to the Romans that Jesus, Paul, and their followers, the Christians, were not politically dangerous to Rome. This would be an important point Luke would want to make in a Roman court, especially one that is being presided over by the emperor. After identifying Theophilus as the direct recipient of the Gospel of Luke, Luke explains what he hopes his work will accomplish for Theophilus. Luke wants Theophilus to have confidence that all the things he had been told about Jesus and Paul were true and certain. This can be looked at several different ways. One way to see this is to view Theophilus as a Gentile believer who just needs some additional information about his faith to give him confidence in it. Another way to look at this is to see Theophilus as a non-believer Luke is hoping to convert by giving him more information about the life and teachings of Jesus and his apostles, especially Paul. A final way to look at this ties into the idea that Theophilus was the magistrate in charge of Paul's case in Rome. Theophilus had already heard Paul and others' testimonies about Paul's actions and the why behind them. Luke wanted to provide additional well-researched and organized information and eyewitness accounts supporting these testimonies. Luke wanted to do this to help Theophilus know with certainty the things he had heard so far were true and reliable. This is a situation where looking at the original Greek word used can give us some insight into the passage. In the case of this passage, the Greek word translated as taught is the Greek root word katecheo. The truly interesting thing about this word is that it can be translated several different ways. Katecheo can be accurately translated as to teach, to instruct, or to tell. Depending on which way we translate katecheo, it can have a significant impact on how we interpret Theophilus' relationship to both Luke and the documents Luke is writing. To show what I mean when I say the way katecheo is translated can have a major impact on how we understand Theophilus' relationship to both Luke and the documents Luke is writing, I'll quote an excerpt from the Louw Nina Greek-English lexicon. Concerning the things you have been taught, Luke 1:4, it is also possible to understand katecheo in Luke 1:4 as denoting merely what has been told rather than what has been taught. This distinction is an important one since it implies quite different relationship of Theophilus to the text of the Gospel of Luke. If Luke 1:4 pertains merely to Theophilus being told something, then one might assume Theophilus was not a Christian, in which case he may have been a government official to whom the joint publications of the Gospel of Luke and Acts would have been directed as a defense of Christianity. On the other hand, if one understands katecheo in the sense of the to be taught or to be instructed, then one would assume that Theophilus was a Christian who had been instructed in the faith. As you can see from this quote, how we translate katecheo can have a major impact on how we understand the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. If we translate katecheo as told, then it supports B.H. Skeeter's suggestion that Theophilus is the magistrate charged with overseeing Paul's trial before the emperor. However, if we translate katecheo as taught, then it supports the idea that Theophilus is a fellow believer Luke was writing to give additional instruction about their faith, or alternatively, was a believing patron who hired Luke to write the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Personally, I tend to lean towards the suggestion of B.H. Skeeter that Theophilus was the Roman magistrate charged with overseeing Paul's trial before Caesar. I lean towards this idea because, as mentioned earlier, it explains some interesting features about the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. One such feature is the fact that Luke records the various trials of Jesus and Paul in great detail, along with the official rulings of those trials. Luke always states that the official conclusion of those trials was that Jesus or Paul, depending on who was on trial, had broken no Roman laws despite whatever else may have happened surrounding these events recorded. This is especially true of the trial of Jesus. While Luke in verses 23:13 through 15 and John in verse 19:6 are the only two gospel writers that record Pilate's official ruling that he found no grounds on which to charge Jesus, Luke goes one step further than John and states that Herod also found no grounds on which to charge Jesus. This last one is especially important because Herod was the person the Romans appointed to be king over the Jewish people. In other words, Herod was appointed by the Romans to be the direct ruler of the Jews in the name of Rome, because from the Roman perspective, Herod was a Jew himself and therefore would be more acceptable as a ruler of the Jews. So if Herod was agreeing with Pilate that there were no grounds on which to charge Jesus, then that would apply not just to the Roman law, but even to the Jewish law as well. Another feature I feel Theophilus, being a Roman magistrate, explains is the fact that Luke seems to go out of his way to have Christianity seen simply as a sect of Judaism and not as a totally different religion. All through Luke's works, especially in the Acts of the Apostles, Luke is constantly pointing out Christianity's Jewish roots and origins. In Acts, Luke even points out several times that the apostles were actively teaching in the Jewish temple. This is seen in Acts 3:12, 5:12, 5:25, and 5:42. One reason Luke would be so interested in having Christianity being seen as a sect of Judaism was because Judaism was officially recognized by the Romans as a legally protected religion. As such, all the followers of that religion also had legal protection. However, if Christianity was seen as a new religion and not a sect of Judaism, then Christianity would not have had legal protection in Rome, and therefore the followers of Christianity would not have legal protection either. This meant that the Roman Empire could do what they wanted to the followers of this religion without having to worry about violating their own laws. I'll talk in more detail about protected versus non-protected religions when we come to verses that this situation applies to. Immediately following Luke's introduction about why he is writing the Gospel of Luke, he jumps right into the actual material he wants to explain. This is the material we'll look at going forward as we look at the Gospel of Luke and then later the Acts of the Apostles. Thank you for listening to my video, and please, if you liked it, go ahead and like and subscribe to my channel. I look forward to the next video.